Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in, and thanks to the Conference of Mayors for getting everybody together today. I'm excited to be speaking with leaders from across the country who are tackling the persistent challenge of homelessness, one of many that became more urgent when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Not only did the virus pose a greater threat to people living in congregate shelters or on the streets, the pandemic also caused an economic crisis that pushed many onto the brink of eviction, held back by eviction moratoria that are bound to expire soon. I'm looking forward to discussing both how you all think the pandemic has changed our perspective on how to address these challenges and talk about best practices for preventing homelessness and increasing affordable housing access. I'm Sarah Holder. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg City Lab, and I'd like to introduce our three panelists. We have Mayor Todd Gloria, the mayor of San Diego. Thanks so much for being here. And Mayor Steve Adler, the mayor of Austin, Texas. And Matthew Dougherty, former executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And I'd love to invite all of you to make some broad remarks about the challenge and opportunities of dealing with the issue of homelessness and talk a little bit about how you've been doing so in your role. So Mayor Adler, can we start with you?
Sure. And I really appreciate the U.S. Conference of Mayors for pulling us all together here in the Civic I.O. program at South by Southwest. It was a year ago yesterday that we pulled down South by Southwest because of the pandemic. And at the time, that decision seemed like such an outlier. Within 2 weeks, it was no longer the outlier. And we have one of the lowest mortality rates in the country right now in Austin. And I don't think we would be in that position had we not made that choice. But in making that choice, it caused huge economic fallout. And it's only gotten greater since then. The economic battles associated with COVID as large as the health issues. And we see that across our entire city, including the community of folks that are experiencing homelessness. And it is that challenge. The challenge of homelessness is one that looms large. It is a challenge that we had before the pandemic, going back to the time that I was elected 6 years ago. That was an issue in my campaign, and the challenge was getting greater and more political every year. There are so many different kinds of people that end up experiencing homelessness. Folks that, yes, some have mental health challenges, some have substance abuse challenges, but most folks are just the victims of the perfect storm. It's people that had a huge medical bill that they really couldn't pay, and then they fell behind on their car payment. When they lost that and started having the financial problems, they started having fights with their partners or spouse, growing into the situation where they would then lose that hold or that community, that family, and the next thing you know, they lose their job and then they lose their apartment and they're on the street. No one to call, no one to turn to. The people on our streets that are without homes, that have full-time jobs, but still can't afford a place to be. It is everybody, and it is everybody's brother and sister and family. But it is a tough challenge, and it's a tough challenge because it is not inexpensive to deal with. The answer to homelessness is getting people homes. And there's really no answer other than that. There are short-term solutions and interventions, but at the end of the day, that's what you have to do. And I think that it is a measure of a community, its character and its culture, whether it steps up to say we are in fact going to take care of those that are the least fortunate or the most challenged among us. It is a question of priorities. It ties into and is at the intersection of how we deal with mental health and poverty. It's at the intersection of institutional racism. Here in Austin, 40% of people experiencing homelessness are African American. It is at the intersection of our greatest challenges. And I believe over the next 5-10 years, it's going to be the measure of who we are. We can talk about it as we go through the panel, but I am proud to live in a city, probably with about an average homelessness challenge, but a city that decided that we weren't going to hide it. We weren't going to just leave it in our rivers and in our woods, recognizing that the cities that chose to do that and just move it around with ordinances are the cities that are now dealing with challenges of such a large scale. I don't know what you do if you're trying to figure out a solution. But by bringing it out and making it visible, we have had the eruption of the largest political issue that I can remember in this city in the last 50 years. And we're in a race. We're in a race with ourselves to see what we can do to, in fact, meet this challenge. A great topic for a panel. Mayor Gloria, great to be on it with you. And Mr. Dowdy, good to be on this panel with you. Thank you for all the help you gave to our city when you were in the president's administration.
Yeah, I'd love to open up the floor to Mayor Gloria. I know that, homelessness was a big priority for you coming into office late last year. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And thanks for this opportunity, Sarah. It is an awesome opportunity to share the stage with Mayor Adler, a more seasoned mayor. I'm on my 86th day as mayor of the city of San Diego. He has a few more years ahead of me, but between our combined experience, hopefully we can shed some light on this, I think, truly important issue, and to be with my friend Matthew Doherty, whose work I've long admired and who is now helping our city to try and realign our response to this problem. This is just a great opportunity, and I'm grateful for anyone who tuned in on this issue that's a passion subject throughout my career. I've often said that in my work in municipal government, I'm happy to pick up your garbage in exchange for the opportunity to work on homelessness and housing issues. You got to do both as mayor. You got to have the water running, the sewer system working. But we have to, as Mayor Adler was talking about, focus on this issue that is increasingly prevalent across the country, not just in the high cost communities, not just the coastal communities. As a former state legislator, I think the first surprise I had when I arrived in Sacramento several years ago with a homelessness agenda was the alignment between myself and my rural colleagues, who increasingly were seeing larger populations, as Mayor Adler said, along the riverbanks, in the woods, and in the outside areas. While that could be cause for pessimism, I always saw that as opportunity. Politics is about addition. And when you see folks across a state all identify this as a priority issue, then you're able to get change, right? You're able to make it a priority. You're able to dedicate the resources, the bandwidth to making change. And that's one of the things that gives me hope. As Mayor Adler mentioned, this is a unique time for the issue of our unsheltered population. Sarah, I often explain to people that this is the most complex problem for which people seek simple solutions, and there simply aren't any. And I think COVID, the pandemic, has maybe exacerbated that divide as people are understandably frustrated by the duration of stay-at-home orders, of the alterations to their everyday life, teaching their children at home, whatnot, that the often disruptive experience of seeing people in their unsheltered conditions in their community makes them even more upset. And they're calling for change. And what people in positions of leadership like me and Mayor Adler have to do is resist those simple solutions that we know don't work, and then do the work of grinding it out and making progress. And I would just make this observation. I know we have more opportunities to dialogue, but from what I know from doing this work for a very long time is that the solutions often don't involve any kind of ribbon cutting. There's not a lot of press releases that you can do about having a by name registry, about doing a vulnerability index, by working with providers to actually site housing in appropriate locations. And what we have to do here in San Diego is get off of what has largely been sort of a shiny object approach. Here is what we are doing today for homelessness. where it is not a part of a cohesive and functional ecosystem that really says that we can reasonably move folks from the streets into housing and keep them housed long term. Sarah, as you mentioned, my election as mayor last year really hinged a lot on this question. It was really a question posed to the people of San Diego, not just between two personalities, but between two different visions of homelessness and how to address it. I strongly supported a housing first approach, recognizing that it's difficult to address underlying conditions when people are left on our streets, and an opposing point of view that was really, I think, much more backward looking in the sense that you have to get right before we can provide you services. I think we've seen that play out over decades. It's not successful. Transitioning San Diego to a much more aggressive approach of housing first, guided by compassion. I think it's going to be a test of my administration, and like Mayor Adler, I look forward to being able to visit with you all over the next number of years to tell you how it's going.
Great. And yeah, Matthew, I mean, you have such a long legacy of doing this work as well. Can you give us a brief overview of what you've been doing and what you've seen change over your time in the field?
Sure. So I mean, I think, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. And I've had a chance to know both Mayor Adler and Mayor Gloria for many years, and just really want to thank them for their continued dedication and commitment to working on these issues. I think what I first want to highlight is that homelessness is absolutely a national issue and a national crisis. And we don't have great data. We don't have the perfect data, but the best estimate is that more than 550,000 people experience unsheltered homelessness, sleeping on streets and parks and other places not meant for human habitation, or staying in shelters any given night. And more than 1.5 million people experience homelessness over the course of the year. And many, many more people experience other forms of housing instability and unsafe and unstable housing, doubled up, overcrowded, staying in situations that actually aren't safe for them. So I think, as Mayor Adler highlighted, it really is a prevalent problem, but also one that can impact anybody. But it also is a deeply local issue and requires local responses supported by federal and state and local resources. But it's not a uniform story all across the country. When we look at the 2019 data released by HUD, they showed that there were communities that were making progress, and more states, 29 states in the District of Columbia, actually reported reductions, and fewer states reported increases. We don't have the 2020 data publicly available yet, and I think 2021, the pandemic has really damaged our ability to know exactly how the pandemic has affected those numbers. But I think we can all expect that we'll see increases as a result of all of the impacts. And then the COVID-19 pandemic has had a drastic impact on people experiencing homelessness, but has also starkly revealed the racial inequities across our systems, both in the experiences of homelessness, but also the risks of the virus, the risks of the mortality from the viruses, and the economic impacts. And so when I think about the experience of the last year or so, it's actually really showed us what we needed to have in place in our responses to homelessness that we did not have in place pre-pandemic. But now hopefully we can take these lessons and build the responses that we need from those lessons learned. And we actually have some unique opportunities to start to build those systems. Resources at the federal level in response to the pandemic through the CARES Act, through the Combined Appropriations Bill, and through the American Rescue Plan that just passed the Senate a little bit earlier on the day we're filming this, actually deliver a scale of resources that should allow us to make really substantial progress across the full range of the kinds of investments that are needed to provide the solutions. So I think starting off, just want people to start hearing the message that this actually is a solvable problem, but it takes will, it takes resources, and it takes the right strategies and the right practices.
Absolutely. I mean, that sort of brings me into my first question. COVID really upended the conventional wisdom about how to deal with many public health and social issues, and it spurred many cities to institute policies, like you were saying, that were once deemed maybe radical, like housing people in hotels, enforcing eviction moratoria, freeing up all that federal money. How would you all sort of describe the status quo on homelessness in your city or at the federal level in your field of work? And what were the most immediate changes that we saw last March under these, as I mentioned, unprecedented circumstances? Let's start with you, Matthew, since you kicked us off.
Okay. So I think I want to give a quick review of kind of the history of our responses to homelessness and then how COVID-19 pandemic has helped reinforce where we need to be headed. It'll be a fairly simplified version of the story because I don't want to take too much time. But I think as Mayor Gloria touched upon, sort of some of our early responses to homelessness when it was first becoming our crisis in our country really focused on emergency responses and setting up emergency shelter. And then on top of that, we started to put on lots of rules and expectations and requirements and created very complicated pathways for people to get help and to get out of homelessness. And the fundamental shift over the last couple of decades have been communities taking down those systems and replacing them with systems that really understand that the fundamental objective is to get people back into housing with the services and supports they need to be successful. And I think COVID-19 pandemic has made that even more of a compelling need and a requirement for how we respond to homelessness. So we do talk about that as a housing first approach that emphasizes housing as the opportunity that people need in order to find stability and to use it as a platform to address their challenges, pursue their goals, and really be able to move on with their lives. I do also want to dispel a few misrepresentations or misinformation about what Housing First is. Housing First is fundamentally about recognizing that people need that stability in order to be successful. But on top of that, many people need other kinds of services in order to take advantage of that opportunity. Sometimes that's health services, sometimes that's behavioral health care services, sometimes that's employment assistance, a variety of things. But if anyone ever says to you that Housing First means housing only, I want to be blunt, they just don't know what they're talking about. And the other thing we sometimes hear is that Housing First is kind of a Band-Aid, one-size-fits-all solution. But Housing First actually requires us to recognize who people are, what they specifically need and want for themselves, and to tailor our responses so that each and every household can be successful. So again, if anyone ever says to you, Housing First is a one-size-fits-all solution, and I've been hearing that a lot lately, actually, they actually don't know what they're talking about because that's actually the exact opposite of what Housing First is. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how important home is for all of us. And for those of us who've been lucky enough to have a safe place to be during this pandemic, I think the value of that has been felt even more strongly than ever before. And so if taking our own experiences and recognizing how important that is for everybody and making sure that when we respond to homelessness, we think primarily about where people need to be safe and stable and successful. And that is always a place that they can call home.
Absolutely. And what about you, Mayor Adler? What changed in March?
You know, for us, the landscape dealing with homelessness has changed a lot over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, because that's when we changed our ordinances and we made it no longer criminal activity to experience homelessness. Certainly, if you're endangering public safety or public health, you need to be stopped. And the full sanctions of the law are available to stop that from happening. But if you are visible and present and apparent, but not creating a public safety risk or a public health hazard, it's no longer criminal. What that means is a lot more people have become visible. A lot more people are now in safer, better places than they were before. What that means is that a community were able to find a lot of people that was difficult finding before and to see them more regularly. So we're able to get support to people that we, in a greater rate, we're able to get people tied to pathways to housing at a greater rate. And our community was going through this transition, creating a huge political backlash. In fact, there's a citizen initiated referendum on this issue coming up in May. But it was becoming more and more visible, and then the pandemic hit. And at that point, then we're dealing with trying to end as many congregate living situations as we can in order to keep people healthy. We're trying to give people space and attention. We're trying to increase our opportunities to test and isolate the virus when we see it. That too encouraged people to come out and stake out a place, again making the activity more visible. We have been fortunate in our city. We immediately pulled some motels into an operation so that we could isolate people, so that when in a shelter situation, we had an initial outbreak of the virus, we isolated it quickly and immediately saw that we needed to do something else other than congregate sheltering. Again, increasing the visibility of people in public spaces, but also making creative use of motels. We've now wholeheartedly going into that strategy and are purchasing hotels on an ongoing basis to be able to provide permanent supportive housing opportunities, maybe some rapid rehousing opportunities, because the funding streams from the federal government and state law are complicated. And unfortunately, you have to make choices on function based on funding source, which may not be the best choices or the easiest choices in the real world. But the virus has given us some additional money to be able to put to this end. But we also have a FEMA reimbursement system that seems to be pushing back against that. So some of the non-congregate living we were able to create to take a really vulnerable population that comes in with a lot of comorbidities, folks we want to be able to put into a protective lodging kinds of situation. We've spent a lot of money, and FEMA has not clearly indicated that's something that they're going to reimburse because they think we're trying to solve homelessness and not respond to the pandemic. We know that what was driving this was the pandemic response. And other than that initial outbreak, we've done really well with making sure that we didn't lose people in this community and that this community didn't serve as a source of increasing infectivity in our community. But what the other thing that this pandemic has done that I think is significant in March is it really has made our community look at the disparities that exist. We've all known they were there. We've all talked about them for a long time. But when you see so many people dying and being hospitalized that are of color, and you're seeing it on the news every night, and you're stuck at home and you're not out, so you're probably watching more news than you ever have before. This pandemic has been like an event that has grabbed our hands, put them on both sides of our face, and not let us turn away from these systemic injustices. My hope is that all of these things together, the visibility, the need, the realization that while some of us have actually weathered this pandemic pretty well, others of us, it has been an incredible disaster. My hope is that this time, this disruptive moment, when we're dealing with so many whiteboards in so many different places, gives us the real opportunity to get the political will and the direction and the resources to actually deal with this challenge in ways that would not have otherwise come to us. But the jury is still out on that, and we're trying to drive it home.
And Mayor Adler, just because you mentioned the 2019 ordinance that decriminalized camping in the public way a couple of times, you also mentioned that there's this citizen-initiated ballot initiative that's hoping to overturn it, that's headed through the court system right now. I'm wondering, do you think that opposition campaign has the chance, and what that reflects about the political realities on the ground in Austin, and how you would proceed if that did get on the ballot?
I think that it's on the ballot.
Okay.
the court battle was over the language on the ballot. That's now been resolved.
Okay.
So it's on our ballot, and it will be voted on, and it will be a close vote. And I think that it's a close vote in part in a progressive community like Austin. We have to recognize that not only do we need to do a better job of actually housing people that don't have homes, which is what the thrust of the original June 2019 action was. Not only does that take resources and commitment, because it does, and people need to understand that, to be able to reach an equilibrium place. We were able to do it with veterans. We were one of the cities to accomplish that. I was hoping we could then scale that up to the rest of the community, only to learn, I think, that a lot of the success for that was about veterans and not about homelessness. So it was hard to drive the same level of commitment more broadly in the community. But by making homelessness more visible, and before that ordinance, in 2016, we wrote like 18,000 tickets to people that were experiencing homelessness because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, usually nearer to be in front of a business. And of course, very few of those people showed up in court the following Thursday to take care of that ticket. So a bench warrant issued. And the next thing you know, 6 months later, when we're trying to get them a home or a job, they're disqualified because now they have a criminal record rising out of that ticket. That wasn't because they were creating a public health hazard or a safety risk. They were just experiencing homelessness. We knew and learned that wasn't the right answer. So the changes that we made at this point will be up. We know we need to house people, but what we also failed to do was to really properly manage shared public spaces, and that, I think, is what so many in the community are reacting to right now in wanting us to do something. We're working really hard. We're going to be launching a community summit here in the next 4 weeks. I think Matthew's helping us with that, among others, that I hope will present to the community a third choice. Going back to where we were before, which is what this referendum does, will only send people back to the woods. And frankly, I can't do that. The people won't disappear. They'll still be there. But at the same time, we have to do a better job than what we have been doing. And my hope is that, over the next several months, we're going to be able to elevate a real plan to be able to deal more holistically with this challenge from more perspectives. But it is the political issue in our city right now, and almost everything else is a proxy for that issue. The issues we're having on reimagining policing is really about the challenge of homelessness. But regardless of how the vote turns out, our challenge will remain exactly the same. If the vote wins or the vote loses, we don't increase or decrease the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. And the action that we need to take is still exactly the same. And now that my community has seen homelessness in a very upfront and direct and scaled kind of way, I don't think that those mental impressions go away. Mm-hmm. So while I think this election is important, it's not necessarily key. The work is key, and that won't change regardless of what happens.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that election plays out. I mean, I know, Mayor Gloria, you've also talked about the importance of meeting homeless residents, not with police officers, but with mental health and social workers. I'm wondering, I know that's a model that's been replicated in a lot of cities across the country, especially in the last year. People are really excited about that as a model. I'm wondering if you could talk about what it would take to make that happen in San Diego and why that's a priority for you.
It is a priority, and it's the work that I'm actively engaged in. As recently as last night, we were working with our police department and our environmental services department to try and do precisely that. But Sarah, this is the tough work, right? This is hard stuff. My predecessor really, I think, utilized law enforcement far more than the community or law enforcement is comfortable with. And I'm left in a position of trying to transition to less law enforcement interaction. And that's difficult. One, because there's some who would suggest that we just pull back law enforcement entirely overnight, cease any sort of operations that ignores the constituent concerns for that business owner that has an encampment in front of their business. But it also means that the field of play is unengaged, meaning to say, right now, our police officers admit more homeless individuals into our shelter system than all of our nonprofit providers combined. And it speaks something to the efficiency and the compassion with which our law enforcement often does this work, but also speaks to the inefficiency of the millions of dollars we spend on homeless services that the police department is outperforming. And so switching overnight, simply pulling the police department back, would leave our roughly 8,000 unsheltered population or homeless population throughout our county with no interaction. And so we are standing up non-law enforcement-based outreach teams that is basically in place today in terms of the contracting vehicles. The hiring is going on now, and then standing that up and increasing their outreach while simultaneously decreasing law enforcement is the strategy that I'm trying to pursue. Again, this is a work in progress right now. And it's extremely difficult. If I can kind of key off of something that Mayor Adler was discussing a moment ago, the angst and the anger around this issue is very real. And I say that's in part because many of the interventions that have happened during the pandemic have been phenomenal. They've been things that, as a longtime housing activist, I never thought was possible. Rent relief, eviction moratoriums, millions of dollars given to our city by the state of California to procure hotels and to convert them into permanent housing options. We're housing hundreds of people in record time. Typically, it's going to take years to be able to put that kind of inventory into our system. And we've done it in a matter of months. That said, that means many of our, I don't want to overcharacterize, many of our easier members of our unsheltered population are in the system. They're being served. And so who is left on the streets are some of our most acute cases, the folks with the highest amount of behavioral health issues, the highest number of substance use conditions. And so as a consequence, the public has a disconnect, right? They're hearing me out there saying, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this and that. And what they see in their own life is, as they're at home more than they've been in the past, more behaviors that concern them, and a propensity potentially to shift to ask for more law enforcement at a time when I'm trying to do less. This is the essential challenge. This is why this is tough work. And this is why, going back to what I said before, there's no press release that's going to solve this issue. There's no press conference, photo op that's going to solve this. It's going to be grinding it out and finding the right balance of policies, the right convergence of personnel, uniform, non-uniform, to take care of this problem. But like I think others on this panel, I'm optimistic that it's doable, and I ask you to watch what we're doing here in San Diego for proof that it will be possible.
Absolutely. I mean, another, hot button issue is preventing homelessness through increasing access to affordable housing. Mayor Adler and Mayor Gloria, you both lead to increasingly expensive cities. Mayor Adler, I know you've been absorbing at least a few San Francisco transplants. I'm still here, but how do you and other urban mayors with a homelessness challenge deal with both the immediacy of the homelessness crisis that we're talking about and also that long-term challenge of maintaining growing access to affordable housing?
Well, Sarah, I want you to know you're always welcome to come home. The issue of having affordable housing in a community where the supply of housing is very limited, and because it's an attractive place and a desirable place, more and more people are coming, is a real significant challenge. And it's a challenge not only for people who are experiencing homelessness, it's a challenge for virtually everybody at every price point in a community. The market will serve to provide housing at many of those market points because there's sufficient profit and incentive for the market to react. But the market will not provide the housing at the lower price points because that same market incentive is not there. And in some ways, it really does require something which is extra extra market in order to be able to deal with. So the most direct way to deal with that is through subsidy. It's taxing people, taxing themselves in order to be able to provide subsidies to drive affordable housing. And certainly Austin community has stepped forward to do its fair share of that. We just had the largest affordable housing bond here 2 years ago in the history of the city, threefold larger than anything that had been attempted before, unsuccessfully, I might add. So we're certainly doing that, but you can't address this issue just that way because there's not enough capacity to be able to do that. So you really have to take a look at how you do land planning in your city. How you use the tools that are available other than subsidy in order to provide incentives. Now in Austin, because we live in Texas, we don't have a lot of the tools for affordability that many other cities have. We don't have rent controls, say. We don't have inclusionary zoning where we can require things to be built. So in Texas, it's built around an incentive system. I can give people more height, more density, more ability to be able to maximize market revenue on a piece of property in exchange for an obligation to provide greater affordability. While I can't require that affordability, I can coax it by providing bonus elements. So we're in the process of redoing our land development code in order to be able to maximize those opportunities. I believe that housing supply has a huge impact on housing price. I don't believe that by itself it is a direct translation one-to-one because nothing is quite that simple. But I believe it has a huge impact. And in a city like mine, where you have legacy neighborhoods and the like that fit really well, 45-second drive from downtown, as a city becomes 1 million and is doubling in population, and a region's doubling in population every 20 to 25 years, there are going to be, over time, certain concessions that have to be made, allowing more density along commercial roads and allowing residential uses in areas that wouldn't ordinarily have had it. So I think that it's partly developing a transportation system that enables people from farther away to be able to commute more reasonably to other parts of the town. And our city in this past November, mid-pandemic, did the largest citizen-initiated project to really bring to Austin mass public transportation. I think all these things will help us with affordable housing long run. For us, it's existential. Austin is Austin because we're a city that creates art as opposed to a city that consumes art. And if we're going to maintain ourselves as a city that creates art, we have to maintain artists. We have to maintain in our community the people that are the creatives. So for us, maintaining that measure of affordability will decide whether or not we survive as the magical place I think we are.
And Matthew, you're working with both of these mayors, closely in other cities across the country to address some of these issues and specifically around homelessness. I'm wondering if you can share, how you're advising them to be working with state officials, county officials, federal officials to push forward some of the innovations or the needed interventions that we're talking about.
Sure, and I'll let the mayors represent their own communities, but I'll talk kind of what we're seeing across the country. I mean, the response to homelessness was already stressed and strained and under-resourced, and the pandemic just made that much more challenging for the organizations who are dedicated to this work every single day to respond. And the other big challenge we've seen is even as resources have been scaled up, it's been hard for the systems to scale in response and to mobilize those resources and the best practices and to actually move with urgency to provide the level of assistance that could actually now be provided by the funding. So I think that is one of the issues that communities are fundamentally working on, is figuring out how to respond when the opportunity to scale much closer to the scale of need, probably not all the way there, but to get much closer, then the capacity itself prevents us from making that progress. So we have got to solve that challenge. And I think that's an area in which business leaders, tech leaders, entrepreneurs, others could really think about how they can contribute to their community's solutions in those areas. Because I don't know what all the solutions are to get to this capacity, but if we miss this opportunity when we have these resources, we'll end up in a much worse place than we could be. And that includes resources that are allowing for capital development. So the American Rescue Plan has about $5 billion in there that would be for capital costs associated with affordable and supportive housing and interim housing. And we also have housing markets where there's more opportunity to acquire properties right now because of the economic impacts. If we can't get those resources and that opportunity together, we're going to miss a huge opportunity. The American Rescue Plan also includes resources for housing choice vouchers, sometimes called Section 8 vouchers, that subsidize people's ability to afford units that they couldn't afford with their base income alone. That's an area in which we have got to mobilize those resources and get them in the hands of people who experience the greatest crises. And we've had some infusion of emergency rental assistance to prevent evictions and loss of housing and entries into homelessness. But we need to use those resources as wisely as we can and to really target those to the people and the neighborhoods that have been most impacted and who are actually genuinely at most risk of homelessness. So part of the challenges that communities are facing are capacity, but also making sure we're really investing in the responses that are going to be targeted enough that will have the direct impact. And sometimes we let those opportunities pass us by. And I think about that as how we structurally sustain homelessness, is when we have an opportunity to use these resources, but we don't do it in a way that's going to have the most direct impact. We're actually just allowing homelessness to remain in place in our community. So we have to seize this opportunity. But that challenge is not easy, and knowing how to get to the scale of staff and organizations with capacity and processing these resources quickly is something that I think we really do need business community partnership and entrepreneurship to think through what are the solutions when they have this opportunity to scale quickly. Businesses can scale more quickly than sometimes we see in the public and the nonprofit sectors.
Yeah, can you say more about the role of nonprofit and private companies in helping in these efforts and where they're already stepping in?
Sure. I mean, the response to homelessness is inherently a public and private partnership virtually everywhere in the country, that the resources are often public resources supplemented with private donations, but the organizations primarily working on the ground with people directly are nonprofit organizations, faith-based communities who struggle at times to be able to understand and embrace all of the best practices. So they're a really important role for the public sector in making sure that the funding is specifically targeted in supporting the strongest and the best practices. And then I think of a fundamental role for the business community as kind of creating the space in which public systems, elected officials, and nonprofits can do their best work without the expectation of short-term and quick fixes. So creating the political will, being voices that mobilize other business leaders to be supportive of the strongest and best practices. But I will say sometimes in communities, we see business leaders who want those quick fixes, those easy solutions, and who undermine the hard work of building the lasting solutions by expectations that are out of line with what's realistic, or expectations that then aren't supported by the investments that would make it possible to do those. So I think that's a fundamental role for the business community, is to understand the solutions that are needed and to create the will within their community to allow those solutions to be implemented effectively.
Right. And, Matthew is talking about some new resources that COVID has freed up at the federal level, but also cities' budgets themselves are very strained right now. Mayor Gloria, can you talk about what challenges COVID has wrought on your city budget and how that impacts what kind of work you're able to do in the homelessness community?
How much time do you have? it's hard. Well, I can quantify it, but the numbers don't mean anything to individual people, right? So
Yeah.
we are a city that's dependent on tourism. We have a great military sector. We have a great innovation economy, manufacturing and whatnot, but we are very tourism heavy. And naturally, people aren't traveling. So a lot of our hotels are just empty. We've been able to convert some of them into permanent supportive housing for homeless, but at the end of the day, they're not paying tourist taxes because they're staying home. What does that mean? An $86 million budget deficit has opened up in our current year budget. And I'll tell you that on the day I was inaugurated back in early December, it was about 45 million. Today, it's grown to 86 million. And next year, we're projecting $154 million budget deficit. Right, so we are counting on and hopeful for federal relief, and there's positive signs, but I can't balance a budget, so I have the check that allows me to do it. And my extreme fear, Sarah, is that my city, a lot of our city employees have been repurposed into homeless services. The librarians who aren't working at branch libraries are now at some of our shelters serving folks. They have been doing that throughout the course of the pandemic, really putting themselves, I think, in harm's way, right? They're not sheltering at home. They're working with some of our most vulnerable people. And there's a very real potential that in the not too distant future, their reward for stepping up in a difficult environment is to either cut their salary or lay them off. And so this has the potential of undermining the progress that we've been able to see during the pandemic with this flood of resources. And it's also kind of disjointing to the public, right? Because they see me saying we have a nearly $100 million rental relief fund that's a combination of federal and state funds. But at the same time, I'm telling them about this massive budget hole. It doesn't make sense, right? Why are you giving away this money here, but you have this hole here? Point is, it's a very difficult time to budget and to balance a municipal budget. We will do it with or without federal resources. But I recognize right now, at a time when people are hurting and they're actually turning to the public sector more than ever, we need to be able to respond to those calls for help from our most vulnerable residents, those who are unsheltered, and from working families who've been hard hit by the pandemic. Without additional federal and state resources, I'm fearful that we will not be able to do that, and that will be missing a moment and potentially adding to the ranks of folks who are unsheltered in our community.
And I just had one more question. You're seeing sort of a light at the end of the tunnel with this pandemic. Vaccines are rolling out, but some of the eviction moratoria and some of those hotels or initiatives started to weather the pandemic are now potentially sunsetting. I'm wondering if all of you can talk about what opportunity and what necessity this next chapter brings. And maybe we can start with you, Matthew. What do you see as most important in the coming months as the pandemic hopefully becomes less severe?
What I'm hoping is that in many areas of our lives, we don't think about coming out of the pandemic as just a return to normal. Right. We actually take the experience of going through this pandemic together as a country and take the lessons, take the prevalence of the inequities that were so starkly revealed, take the impact on people who don't have stable housing and actually become something different than normal, because normal wasn't working for so many of the people in our country. And I think that's true just across all of our senses, ourselves as communities and society, but also in the work to end homelessness, to really take the lessons of what we had to do when we were faced with this crisis that tells us what we should be doing with the crisis of homelessness every day. And that's, as Mayor Adler was just describing, having the capacity to get out there and find people and talk to them and give them opportunities and give them choices to come inside. It's creating sheltering environments that people see as a real and meaningful opportunity and a safe and healthy opportunity, because even outside of a pandemic, large congregate shelters are not environments that a lot of people see as an opportunity for themselves. And then we take the lessons that we've all learned about how important being home is to ourselves and to our own well-being, and add even more urgency to the goals of housing people experiencing homelessness, because as the most intuitive solution to homelessness is housing people, and for us all to really take the lessons of the pandemic and recognize that and become voices for the humanity of people experiencing homelessness, become voices for the investments and the scale of solutions that we need, including becoming voices in support of housing development in our communities and in our very own neighborhoods, and see that as our responsibility together to build a future that's not the normal that we had before the pandemic, but is actually better and stronger and can help people be parts of our communities more fully.
Absolutely. What about you, Mayor Gloria? What do you hope to see?
I don't know if I can say it better than Dory, because that was pretty good. I'm hopeful for the American Rescue Plan to pass. God bless Joe Biden for proposing it. And thank you to every member of Congress who's voting for it. I think that will make a transition from this period of emergency into some sort of new normal, hopefully better than before, a bit smoother than it will be otherwise. I just sort of foresee a long-scale transition. I think we've nibbled around it here, but we had a housing and homelessness crisis before the pandemic. We have one today, right now. In fact, this is still the thing that people talk to me the most about. At a time when we're concerned about our own health and the health of our families, our personal economic situation, and that of our family, San Diegans continually talk to me the most about this issue. And so we still have a crisis state, and it is extremely likely that it could be worse afterward. And so that transition is going to be really important. But I would just echo what Matthew said. As someone who spent a lot of time in rec centers and library community rooms talking about community plan updates for how development should play out in a community, working in the legislature on bills that say yes in my backyard. I'm hopeful that Americans in general, Californians particularly, and San Diego specifically, would say the last year really taught them the importance of home. They were home, and it provided security at a time when we told people that you need to stay home in order to protect your life. I hope that they will come out of this with a great deal of reverence for the meaning and the concept and the physical thing that is our homes, and then extend that to others in their community, whether it be to a working professional that just wants to be able to buy a home in the community that they work in, or to that person who's currently without housing, recognizing that if it's good enough for your family and if it's the best way to protect your family, that you should extend that courtesy to others, and that you should support more housing development in your community, that you should support legislation that does it, you should support elected officials that do it, and then you should hold us all accountable for delivering it. This could be transformational if we can maintain the political will. I'm certainly game to do my part. And again, I hope that that's a lesson learned from this experience. And as Matthew says, we don't simply turn off Netflix, go back to our offices and act like this never happened, but that we really internalize what it is to have a home, how fortunate that is when you have one, and how everyone should have that opportunity to have a place to call home.
And Mayor Adler, let's end with you.
Meeting the challenge of homelessness in our cities is going to require a pretty significant disruptive change because on the path that we are on, generally speaking, in our cities, we're not going to be able to do it. The scale of the change and the focus and what's necessary is so great and specific, it's really going to require true disruption. I look at what we have just gone through this past year as an invitation disruption. I mean, who would have thought that we would have lived the lives that we have lived the last year and will continue to live for the next few months while this vaccine comes out? When you look at our country's history, at the periods of time that have had the greatest measure of disruption, those have also been the times that have birthed the greatest disruptive social innovation and change going forward. Social Security, the things that came out of the Great Depression, the initiatives that came out of World War II. We are in that moment of time right now. I go back to what Matthew said and what the mayor said. Shame on us if we come out of this pandemic and return to where it was that we were before. We have got to come out of this period of time better communities, better people, better able to meet and realize the challenges that are in front of us. There's an invitation at this moment to leverage the disruption that we have all been feeling, to really give meaning to the social justice and civil rights and racial justice moment of this summer, because this is a racial issue in virtually every city in the country. I believe this is a gift of a moment. It is the silver lining in this cloud that is the pandemic, to really bring about fundamental, disruptive social change of a scale that is generational. I believe this is within our grasp if we are willing to do it with a community that sees injustice in ways that it did not see before. The challenge for us is going to be to do this in a way that does not immediately become partisan and political. But the good nature of people to want to do better for the least fortunate among us is in many respects a nonpartisan issue. And that's what I hope we can build on as communities. In my community, we have had a decade of fighting between those people that wanted to deal with homelessness and its challenge by basically gathering everybody together and providing as humane a place as we could somewhere at the edge of town. But to get people off the street and out of tents and into a congregate setting that served the purpose of both providing a safer place and letting the shared public spaces be all that it could be. And on the other side, and that group not really buying into permanent supportive housing because it cost too much and it took too long. On the other hand, I had part of my community that would not even engage in a conversation about managing shared public spaces because it almost seemed an immoral conversation to be having, because you're talking about real people and real critical situations. And the only focus should be on permanent solutions with housing. In this moment, in this time, I have those two sides that are side by side, that are willing to work for the priorities that the other had in order to be able to drive a single solution. And I think that would not be in its place right now, absent this pandemic. And I think that ultimately all of us that are in leadership at this moment in time are going to be judged on the question of how did we manage the pandemic? And how did we manage the recovery from the pandemic? And this is central and core to that.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you all for ending on a hopeful note or an understanding that there's more work to be done, but that you're ready to do it. I really appreciate you all coming out here today and speaking to me. And thank you to the U.S. Conference of Mayors for organizing the panel.